Subliminal warfare, mind control, and the invisible influence has generated the position of their advanced techniques in order to generate subversions to the general public to undermine the civilian-led government at all levels, as the mechanism having been turned against the American population has systemically been used for all forms of hate crimes, especially political influence, expanding the function of anything that would be considered undesirable policy to actively have the use of the military activities to undermine them in the advanced COINTELPRO operations in order to engage in the subversion of any opposition so that they can, by their criminal activities, generate the laundering of their Confederate policies to overthrow these United States. At which point, the system of outrageous subversive policy degrading the structure of the United States government so that it might not be able or competent to succeed, generates the systems of collapsing the order, which is communist degrowth for the white supremacist communism of the Confederacy, which seeks the eradication of the Americans and replacement, at which point the system of voter fraud gaining the disloyal into positions of power in the absence of an American elected government materializes the function of the advancement of choosing which enemy of America should rule America. And to that extent, the answer must be they're all disqualified and must be replaced by actual Americans. And the subversions which has collapsed the United States and put them into the systemic disadvantages must be corrected with absolute prejudice against all terrorist insurgents who have been using it for those mechanisms as a mechanism of their warfare to overthrow these United States. Their position has included, but is not limited to, the function of having generated criminals of various forms, including the function of the mass school shooters, who, having been traumatized by the Confederacy, which has been accepted as a thing that would generically be discovered as functionally true by Lindsey Graham and others, has asserted itself to have traumatized the parties into compliance as a Manchurian candidate, materializing the injuries to the person until they've complied, at which point the shooter for the children's school would have been traumatized into a substantially unhealthy brain, as signifying the will of the person's superiority in comparison to many others on the basis of how much trauma it would have had to have suffered in order to get him to do as they pleased, including but not limited to the function of their Confederate nigger whipping ways, in which case the function is not the function of getting the compliance of the party, but the simple enjoyment and sadism of the abuses itself as its own form of entertainment or reality television, which they get to enjoy at the full diversity as they, having full control, can inflict the fully controlled situation into whatever script for the abuse theater as they desire, materializing the infinite entertainment in the full diversity from their black market, enforcing these structures as they gain these multitudes of advantages, including the advantages of their insider trading, which materializes their systematic destabilizing of the American economy as the Americans are replaced by the Confederates by the use of these subversions, which then materializes the enforcement of the white supremacist communism, which then asserts the lower level on the basis of race to have lowered their economic standing and thus status, and thus the function of punishing them for their poverty, which is racism without race, through the corporate espionage contracts, which includes the wide disbursement of the felonies in Wall Street, which has materialized the function of the active advancement of the criminal organization, which has infiltrated itself for the assertion of the superiority of the white supremacists above all other competitors, including their house niggers, which, having acquired the position in cooperation with the criminal operations in the acceptance to commit crimes against their communities, such as the quote unquote thugs, engages in the activity of having been managed the social engineering for the narrative and thus the use of the propaganda actively enforced by the military operations against the United States actively maintains these military grade terror operations against American civilians outside of the legal structure and thus unofficial acts, and to the extent that this is sustained, is systemically barred from the judiciary system, which then materializes the function of their contempt for court as they advance their fraudulent records. Which is why you have the various distraction operations, such as the Uvalde police, who refused to protect the elementary school children in that shooting, which was arranged by these operations. At which point, the Confederates inside the United States, with the full support of those operations, systemically prove and enforce these mechanisms as a demonstration, including the function of ritual initiation, including the function of having to demonstrate your loyalty to them by committing crimes in order to incorporate the obligation to assimilate under their criminal unitary executive theory, disbarring, dismantling, and eradicating the checks and balances from the contempt for the other branches, including the contempt for the hierarchy from the Americans, as the duplicity away from the centralized executive authority of the president is then engaged in the function of plausible deniability, increasing the infinite powers without authority to the subordinate intelligence actors for the Confederate operations in their KKK terror operations, materializing the function of the president not having any authority and thus can deny it, although he is in complete awareness of the misuse of the equipment and is refusing to stop it in his breach of oath of office in dereliction of duty to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. This, to that extent, reveals the insurrectionist double agents disloyal to the United States inside those departments, revealing treason amongst presidents. And to the extent that you have revealed the treason amongst the presidents and other elected officials, then you forcefully generate the obligation to have made the correction against said treason, which is the purpose for the fake attacks against Donald Trump, in order to launder the policies of these functional positions in order to gain the normality on the basis of the illusion under the fake protection systems from these criminal racketeering operations. And to this extent, you have the corruption of the system into the Confederacy for the white supremacist operations and permanent control over the system by its corruption. To which extent you have those materially disloyal to the Constitution in the intelligence community, loyal to the Confederate anarchists, which then materializes the highest threat to national security in American history, materializing the obligation to use the war on terror policies against these terrorist insurgents who, according to the secret records, materially created the war on terror by doing 9/11 as a Project Northwoods operation to engage in the laundering of their planned wars in the Middle East, as well as the development of Confederate policies such as the Patriot Act for the eradication of these United States, which of course incorporates the confidence games of the false hierarchy, compelling the function of the obligation into the duel, which materializes the function of the Constitutional and Declaration of Independence responsibility to overthrow as a right and as a duty any government that is destructive of the purpose of the Constitution and thus is disloyal to it, requiring the restructuring of the government, which is, in practice, no more than asserting a new election cycle, as the government is derived by its administrations, and the administrations cycling through are not particularly interesting or new or difficult to arrange, as these are historically understood mechanisms. And to this extent, it is not in any way stretch of the imagination, even mildly interesting to perform these functions, and thus the legal obligation to compel the duel, which then materializes the uncensoring of these records in order to conduct the proper examination for national security, materializes the end of the threat by America's worst, most dangerous adversaries, and thus anyone in the American military who asserts themselves as any kind of patriot is bound by their oath of office, which they would have to become an oath breaker in order to disobey the material enforcement of the duel, which would favor David Bowles in this arrangement as the functioning aristocracy, with more power according to the Confederate policies than the entirety of the Confederacy, and as the superior entity then returns it to the rule of law, would be the full eradication and disillusionment by an ascetic function to evaporate the white supremacist stranglehold, threatening the American hegemony around the world by the subversive operations. This includes the function of their looking glass operations and other military intelligence functions, which has determined the function of advancing bias on superintelligence, artificial intelligence, which then materializes the examination, similar to the AI art functions, of narratives and potential history and estimates of characters and how they would behave, and thus the ability to manufacture these manipulations for their communism, for the advancements of their particular interest in order to promote them in the full diversity of their potential resources and statuses, asserting their positions and their incomes, and the diminishing of their competitors, which are viable threats to their acquiring of this position, so that the inferior might defeat the meritocracy based winner by the cheats and thus the forfeits, and in the material forfeit demonstrates the obligation to pay the entire value as though their injury would not have happened from the forfeit, and thus the action of the correction of those who would have acquired it by these fraudulent mechanisms to be removed from it, or in the case where they are not a viable criminal aspect or collaborator, to functionally receive David's insurance protections as the functional temporary holder of the position in the absence of the free market under the stressed emergency, materializing their compensation as the enforcement of their services in the state of emergency, which is an obligation for all in this arrangement, such as for those related to David as the aristocracy, to force the duel, which would compel the information, and the best disinfectant is sunlight, and thus the full revealing of all of the information from the Confederate systems materializes the correction and its obligations, and those who would have received the insurance or sold it to David are then, in that original estimate, to have acquired their interest and influence to enforce those services specifically, and thus arrange for the entire changing of the system of those disloyal to America as double agents to be purged, or for them to fully conquer the United States and, having labeled themselves as enemies of war to America, to eradicate the United States in their contempt for it, changing the title and its arrangements as they have never in their history had any intention and following any of the American policies, including their treaties, which they break readily, such as Scott Ritter's position for the United Nations to have operations free and clear of the hierarchy, which then materializes their capacity to conduct the military operations on the basis of the argument that it is merely convenient for them to do so under those arrangements, which then gives a pseudo intellectual position for the Klan activity against the thing without lawful authority, and thus is functionally an unofficial act of insurrection by the insubordinates. And to that extent, the mechanism of Big Boss from Solid Snake and similar type arrangements of their mechanisms of military coups, which has already taken place and is a active demonstration from that video game and its narratives as a basis point of these operations by the enemies of the United States for the white supremacy, materializing the obligation for the immediate retaliation, which by definition would trigger their national security as enemies of America, which requires the American troops to support their responsibilities under that oath of office to engage in the lethal retaliation against the retaliation of law asserting authority. There was an example, I'm not sure of the specific source, but of a guy that was harassed by these systems, which they found the equipment, but then it was disbarred and hidden from the records. I believe it was in Texas, who then, under similar to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre arrangements, had actively been harassed and defamed, at which points the townspeople, not wanting to punish the innocent person who is being harassed by these mechanisms, would then systemically be led to the position of being radicalized into the danger, where he eventually went crazy and was used as a weapon in order to murder a girl, and there was very little that they can do about it, as the functional position of them using the weapon as a military technique requires the function of them to destroy the actual weapon itself instead of the person that's being extorted under that system. At which point, the person being fully overpowered is nothing more than a modular extension to the tool, and thus the mechanism requires the finding and destroying of that system, which would actively be materializing the threat. And to this extent, the hybrid warfare incorporates them extending it to those police forces, which then are happy to participate. And thus, the original theory on the Uvalde shooting, on why the police were unwilling to stop it, is because they were actively being incorporated into the shooting itself. And thus, the preventing of anyone from going in and stopping the shooting of the children would then have been an extension of the hybrid warfare, having corrupted the police forces who were materially responsible for the shooting, similar to the other examples. And thus, they are the threats. So when you go into the policies, such as the people who seem mentally disturbed or something along those lines, that they become disarmed, is generated as a connection point to this, as the military technique to overpower them and use them being harassed as the weapons then generates the expansion of the criminal gun control, similar to in judges, such as in the mechanism of the Philistines politically taking over the Israelis, requires the function of them putting it down, and thus the mechanism of freeing themselves from the system, having disobeyed God and accepted partnerships with the Philistines, have accepted the infinite threat. And similarly, having tolerated the Confederates' existence, we ourselves, as Americans, have betrayed our pact with God and suffer the consequences of his contempt, which, having saturated our society with sin, has generated his absence of protection, and thus in our disobedience, we receive the suffering and the punishment as a retaliation, as a chastisement, which requires us to stop being little fucking pussies and grow a pair and retaliate with absolute force and eradicate this insurrectionist, contemptible threat, which are a toxic hazard. And when containing a toxic hazard, such as in transportation, any toxic hazard which is leaked must be treated with absolute care and not be allowed to come in contact with the human civilization, at which point it would be a functional threat to that human civilization to allow it to not be contaminated, to not be contained, and thus cleaned up in the appropriate mechanisms, such as the creation of the Confederate state, by which to move the contaminants of those loyal to the Confederacy away from human civilization, at which point they would be compelled to pay their national debts of all of the injuries that they have conducted against America and others as national debts. And this is why they believe that David Bowles is the highest threat to them, generating their high grade malicious retaliation, making it an act of treason for public threats to not cooperate with forcing the duel with David Bowles as defending the national security of the United States against these threats, foreign and domestic, these highest grade enemies to the national security, as well as the American hegemony. The consequences of ignoring it would be reflective in historic white supremacist retaliation, such as the coup overthrowing the black elected North Carolina, or the retaliation against the wealthy black communities, which were completely eradicated and drowned in a lake, making the acknowledgement of the absolute military threat they are to peaceful civilian life.